Buenos días a todos.
Good day, one and all.
Perfecto. Muy buenos días a todos.
Good day, one and all.
Al quinto diálogo regional de política del mercado de capitales.
Welcome to the 5th Regional Dialogue of Capital Markets, CapiLAC. Before introducing myself and starting this event, and in order for us to understand each other, let me provide some instructions.
And with the purpose that all of us here understand the dynamics, let me give you some logistics. Primero, vamos a tener.
First, we will have simultaneous interpretation throughout this event. It is very simple to choose a language. In the lower part of your screen, you will see an icon of the globe. When you click on that icon, you will be able to select the language of your preference.
I will switch to English now. We will have simultaneous interpretation. Choosing the language is very simple. At the bottom of your screen, you will find a globe icon. By clicking on it, you will choose the language of your preference. I will give you 5 seconds so you can adjust the preferences. Segundo, los invitamos a que participen.
Second, we invite you to participate in CapiLAC by sending questions and comments. The questions can be sent through the icon of Q&A, which is in the lower part of your screen. That is the second icon going from left to right. You will also be able to make comments through the chat, which is at the right side of your screens, which will also be used to send relevant information and useful links. Right now, we will send you a link to all the materials, presentations, documents, and the bios of our presenters and moderators for CapiLAC 5. Finally, in order to improve our service and to improve on our CapiLACs, it is very important for us to carry out a satisfaction survey, and we kindly ask you to help us with this at the end of our event. I will now introduce myself. My name is Diego Herrera. I am a leader specialist in financial markets of the Ibero-American Development Bank. Together with our friends from the FIAB and ACSDA, ACSDA, we have designed an agenda which is very interesting for our meeting of the Regional Dialogue of Capital Markets, CapiLAC. This is our 5th one. For the past 5 years, we have had this event as part of our Regional Dialogue of Policies. Right now, I would like to thank our associate Olga Cantilla, Claudio Suchovic, the FIAB team, as well as the ACSDA team, starting by Bruce, Viviana, Javier. Thank you to one and all, because I believe that we have been able to prepare an interesting event. Today, together with the representatives of the industry and the financial regulators, we shall speak about very interesting issues, and our event is called Sustainably Financing the Productive Sector from the Capital Markets. And during these 3 days, we shall be talking about very relevant issues for capital markets. Today, we will start with sustainability and the carbon market, which are very, very trend issues. Tomorrow, we will talk about the finance of MSMEs, and on Thursday, we will talk about the technology, not only fintech issues, but also how technologies are applied to the structures of our Latin American and Caribbean markets. Today, we will present the results on our studies on disclosure of sustainability and issues related to climate change. And we will also present tomorrow the results of a study that we carried out with FIAB about the financing of MSMEs. We have a lot to learn, to share, to discuss, and we invite you to actively participate. We promise you that we will look at questions, answers, we're going to curate them, and we will give them to all our moderators so that we may send the questions to the presenters of these 3 days. I cannot finish this introduction without thanking the entire team, Ana Maria, who was the leader for the logistics of CapiLAC, Daniela, Mildred, Romina, Sahara, Silvana, Soani, Veronica, Gonzalo, Jaime, Hugo, and our interpretation teams and our logistics team, as well as Luciana, Valeria, Candela, and Santiago, who are helping us today with the production of this event. Thank you, thank you, thank you, one and all. Without you, this would not be possible. Without further ado, and apologizing for my voice, I will now give the floor to our panelists of the inaugural panel, who will make a presentation of CapiLAC. They will tell us what this event is going to be about. We shall now start with the president of the FIAB, president and the general manager of the Latin American Exchange, Latinx from Panama, which operates in the entire Central American region. Olga, you're very welcome. Olga has more than 30 years of experience in the finance industry. She has worked in investment operations and bank operations in institutional finance institutions locally and regionally. Dr. Cantillo is president of the ACSDA. She is president of FIAB. She is secretary of the Association of Capital Market of the Americas, America, which includes Ecuador, amongst other countries. She's member of the Independent Consulting Committee of the Initiative of the United Nations, SSE, and she's an independent director of the BI Bank Panama and director of the Calicanto Foundation. We are stealing precious moments from her time because she's a very busy person. Dr. Cantilla, you are very welcome, and we will send you the link so that you can see what the Panama Exchange is doing. Thank you so much. Good day to one and all. I want to join Diego in welcoming you. It is a pleasure to see you in CapiLAC. This year, we are discussing very important issues which are focused on sustainable financing. This issue is very interesting for all market players. FILAC, FintechLAC are facilitating this interesting meeting where the exchanges, the regulators, and the main stakeholders of our markets in Latin America and the Caribbean meet. In this space, we can share trends, challenges, and also the regulations of our sector. Last year in CapiLAC, we talked about all the challenges that our countries faced for economic recovery due to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. And this year, we have other challenges in addition to the pandemic. I do not want to go into the details, but I can mention the global inflation, the increase in interest rates, the increase in the price of certain commodities, the war in Eastern Europe, and political risk in addition to COVID. This, as a consequence, has brought a high volatility to the international markets, and it impacts on the markets of the region. Nevertheless, on the exchanges and our centrals, we are focusing on global trends and the opportunities. Not everything is a challenge, and these opportunities and existing trends which have a positive impact on our markets and on our way to do business. It provides the opportunity to innovate, and it helps us to diversify the products and traditional services which we have been offering investors and issuers. During these 3 days of CapiLAC, we shall be talking about these innovation opportunities and trends. Crypto actives, fintech are very important. The proposal to dissemination and disclosure of climate risks, which shall be spoken about during the next panel in CapiLAC, the potential that we have in the region for carbon markets, the trends that we are observing. Some are talking about voluntary carbon markets, others do not mention them, and what is regulation doing about all this? So we will have a presentation of the regulatory trends for the coming year from FIAB, and as Diego mentioned, we are cooperating and have an excellent collaboration with the IDB and BID Invest. And we thank them for the work that they're doing in order to support sustainable development in the markets of Latin America and the Caribbean. We're especially grateful for the cooperation that we have had with the consulting for the financing of MSME through capital markets. We have been working on this, and we have not necessarily been very successful at the regional level nor at the global level. This is how Dr. and Professor Ed Altman will speak to us tomorrow to present the results of the study and his recommendations. We will also have the players from Colombia and Jamaica who will share their visions. I am certain that this will help us to close the gap, or at least to make it as small as possible, to bring MSMEs to capital markets for the financing they require. I will finish by thanking and congratulating Juan Antonio, Diego Herrera, and the entire IDB team for the organization of such an important event where the main players on the capital markets of Latin America and Caribbean are here. Thank you so much for your efforts and dedication, and welcome once again to CapiLAC. Thank you. Thank you, Olga. Thank you so much. We greatly appreciate the cooperation, and we believe that the work we will present tomorrow will be very valuable, and the securities of the entire region will be we have now Mr. Javier Jara Traub, whom we have known for many years, and he is the president of the America Central Securities Depository Association, ACSDA. Dr. Jara has always worked on these issues of securities depositories. He has been the director of many institutions in Chile and abroad. He has more than 30 years of experience in legal and commercial issues, and his experience will help us during today's panels. Javier, please go ahead.
Thank you, Diego, for that introduction. Greetings to all of you who have joined us today. On behalf of ACSDA, I'd like to welcome and thank CapiLAC and the whole team. For those who are not familiar with us, I'd like to tell you about who we are. As Diego was saying, we are an organization that brings together the securities depositories of the Americas and that of South Africa. We are 20 depositories representing 27 countries, and part of our mission as the association we are, a nonprofit, of course, is for our members to obtain information on trends, best practices, so that each one of these depositories can do its best in fulfilling its role. And of course, technology is a very important topic for all the infrastructure entities, and for the depositories in particular. It can be a challenge, but also an opportunity. So we want to provide our members with information, background information, so that each entity can make the decisions that are best for its situation. And we include some of the smallest securities depositories in the world, but then we also have one of the largest ones in the world. So it's a diversity of realities that we include. So we think it helps if we collaborate. In the last few years, we've organized over 14 webinars with the participation of over 2,000 people regarding what Olga was talking about: cybersecurity, digital assets, etc. And these are the most important trends that we are looking at in this industry. And this event is framed within our mission and objective as an organization. And I think it will be an opportunity not just for securities depositories, but also for exchangers, issuers, investors, and the governments themselves, so they can work together and see where these trends are going and how we can face them together, as the title of this event says, so we can face these challenges in a sustainable way. All of you who are already connected, and anyone else who is interested later, I think we should all work together to bring this information massively to an audience that perhaps has no other way to access this information. Let's multiply this effect, because it's a good chance for us to update what we do, and within our own organization, see what the best path forward will be. So once again, thank you to you, Diego, to CapiLAC, for inviting us once again to be a part of this initiative. I'll be in one of the panels later on, so I think on Thursday. So that will be a pleasure. Thank you very much once again for the invitation. Thank you, Javier. We are always very grateful to have ACSDA with us. And as we've shown in previous years, the participation of the central securities depositors as part of the infrastructure of the markets is essential for us. So you will always be included. Finally, we have with us Juan Queterer. He's a division chief of the Connectivity, Markets and Finance division of the IDB. And his career includes very significant and admirable experiences having to do with the capital markets, the financial sector, structuring of financial products. He's had leadership positions in exchanges and in others, and he is the person that the team wants to thank for supporting all of its efforts in making this CapiLAC possible, and also other events. So once again, I want to thank Juan for all of his support in this dialogue, and this idea for CapiLAC that came up 5 years ago would not have been made a reality without him. So go ahead, please, Juan. Thank you very much, Diego, for your kind introduction. I want to thank you and the whole team that is supporting CapiLAC, but also fintech, FinLAC, and many different spaces where the bank and the division have had an interaction with the world, with our corner of the world, our field, which is the financial sector, the banks, regulators, ministers of the economy, etc. I also want to thank Olga Cantillo and Javier Jara for being here with us today, and I'm sure this will be a very successful CapiLAC event. The IDB, for many years before I came to the bank, I came in 2005, and already in the 90s, that was the previous century, the IDB was already supporting the development of capital markets in the region. And it's provided support for significant reforms in terms of securities markets laws to modernize them. They tried to modernize the exchanges, the capital markets in general, deposit systems. And the idea was that these capital markets are a key element of economic development. Everyone agrees with this. There's no argument about this. And so for that reason, we've always wanted to support this very important sector of the economies of the region. We've also tried to find ways to integrate markets. We've worked with the Central American systems, those of the Caribbean. So I think we've had a variety of initiatives that we've supported, political reform, or policy rather, reform programs. We've provided technical assistance for this purpose. We've always been present with the SAPs, which always say what needs to be done, and then it's the bank that has often helped out and financed these reforms. And that's good so far, but now I think there's something that's been developing for a while, but it's coming to a head now. We all see humanity actually has a problem. And what we need to do to solve this problem is decarbonize. By 2025, we want to have zero net emissions for our region and for the world. But we need more than goodwill and the desire to do it, to achieve that. We need a lot of money. The estimates, plus or minus a billion, $125 trillion for the world. And for the region, it's between $3 and $5 trillion. This is a lot of money, and it's money that unfortunately the public sector of these countries will not be able to get. They will not be able to finance these investments for such a large amount of money. And the only alternative we have in order to achieve these high levels of financing funds is if we prepare the circumstances so that the private sector can co-finance along with the public sector the strategy for investment. And this is what will allow us to achieve net zero carbon by 2025. And the key word for the private sector to be able to invest in this type of infrastructure is de-risking, lowering the level of risk. We don't even need to translate de-risking into Spanish because everybody understands de-risking. And de-risking is something that has a certain financial connotation. It is 100% a financial concept, and de-risking is something that needs to be done very economically, because it could cost us a lot of money or it could cost us less money. It could be more effective, less effective, more efficient, less efficient. And this depends to a great extent on the organization of the capital markets and financial systems that are behind this, but in particular, capital markets, which are by nature markets where there's a allocation and a compartmentalization of risk among the various actors of the financial markets. And it is at this time that our support as a bank to capital markets becomes even more important than it has been so far, because it's very laser focused on one element, making sure that de-risking can take place in the best possible conditions and in the most effective and inexpensive way possible. But it's also very important for the underlying mechanism to operate well, so that the markets operate in the best way possible. And this is easier said than done. That's why it's so important for you to be here with us, or for us to be here with you, working together shoulder to shoulder to make sure that the capital markets of the region are much more efficient, are much broader, so they grow and have a much broader range of action than they have so far, because this will allow us to reach a lot of our development goals. And right now, our priority is to establish a basis upon which this movement or these investments, this de-risking, this bringing together of the public and private sectors can take place in the best way possible, so we can reach our goal, which is net zero. So I thank you for being here. I'm sure that the topics being discussed here are relevant toward this objective and others as well that we've always had for capital markets. I hope you have an excellent experience during this meeting. And once again, I want to express to you our absolute and firm commitment as a development bank and as the IDB Group, as BID Invest, not only as a public institution, but on behalf of BID Invest and BID Lab, our strong commitment to the development of these capital markets and our support to use, and that so that this can work in the best way possible. Thank you very much. Have a good day. And back to you, Diego. Thank you very much, Juan. And in fact, this topic that you've been mentioning, decarbonization, is actually the first topic that we'll be discussing here at our CapiLAC 5. And it's a very important topic because, first of all, it requires very clear information and standardization of the disclosure of matters related to climate change. And recently, the IFRS, this is the institution that globally regulates accounting standards, put together a council, the ISSB, for the disclosure of sustainability risk related to climate. And we've also worked on how determining how the region is doing on this. And the idea is to put out a publication at the beginning of next year. And I want to thank Andrea actually for all her support. And I want to thank all our panelists as well, Arturo from the IFRS Foundation, but is representing the interests of the ISSB. He'll have a lot of interesting things to tell you. Kevin, who will tell us about the perspective of a regulator from the Commission of Market Regulators of Chile. Olga, who will be giving us a perspective of market infrastructures, and Andrea, who I started with. She's the director for Hispanic America's Global Reporting Initiative, and we've been working with her. And now I leave you with our partner and friend, Gemma Sacristan. She is the CIO of the IDB Invest. She has deep experience in the financial sector regionally, but globally as well. She's held positions in the Banco Santander and other global institutions, and she's an expert as well on all of these matters having to do with disclosure. and I had a chance to talk to her in the Dominican Republic some weeks ago before we both caught COVID. And we talked to representatives of the financial market in the Dominican Republic. We talked to them about these matters, and one that they were very interested was this one precisely, disclosure. So I leave you with Gema. Thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us, Gema. Thank you very much, Diego. It's a pleasure to be with all of you and to be a part of CapiLAC 2022 with a new proposal for the disclosure of sustainability and climate risks by the Sustainability and Standards Board. And a new road is opened up, I believe, for a regional discussion on how to approach regulations that allow us to mitigate the risk of greenwashing on the one hand, but also allow us to generate new green taxonomies. This is a discussion for regulators, for issuers, for investors, and various different actors having to do with the infrastructure of the capital markets. So we'll start this panel, if I may, with the intervention of the Global Reporting Initiative. Then we'll have a more general vision from the perspective IFRS, as Diego said earlier. And then we will hear from the Commission for the Financial Markets of Chile, and then we will conclude with the Ibero-American Exchanges Commission. So with you, Andrea Pradilla, Director of the Global Reporting Initiative for Latin America, and she will introduce to us a report that we've worked on together between the initiative and the IDB, which mentions some of the sustainability disclosure standards that are in effect in the region. Go ahead, please. Hello, Gema. How are you? Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much to the IDB for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. Can you confirm that you can see my presentation? I hope you can. No, sorry, we can't see it yet. I'm sorry. Once again, now we can see it. Thank you. Again, it's a pleasure to be here, and I will take about 8 minutes to tell you about the compulsory nature of disclosure of financial information. And Diego mentioned the report that will be published in the first few months of 2023. This has been a period of extensive activity in regulation standards and regulatory frameworks in this regard. And curiously, with the team of the IDB, we've said every week when we look at the report, something new has happened and we need to update it. Never have we had so much activity in this regard vis-a-vis this financial information and this climate risk information, how to make it compulsory. So it's a world trend to create this global information system, and there needs to be the same conditions for all and two different perspectives. And for some, it would seem that they are two different things or even contradictory. But the first perspective has to do with impact reports, all those impacts that a company is having on society and the environment, and thus its contributions toward the broader objective of sustainable development. And a second perspective, the information on the value of the company. And here the focus is on information regarding the impact on the companies that are adopting these regulations and standards.
We shall now look at two contexts: the repercussions of activities on an entity in the world and on the entity. The principle of double impact is the main principle to prepare sustainability reports. This means that the companies or corporations will need to consider the material aspect of the economic impact and the impact on sustainability. So we are talking about the convergence of two perspectives. So it will only be not only material, but the financial repercussions and the material repercussions will have to be seen together, and we need to see the double elements. So they will have to assess the external repercussions and also the material issues that are interesting for the corporation and for the interest groups that are within it. So we start on the right with a sustainability report for the global initiative. And here you will see the external repercussions, and we will be able to see what are the repercussions on the financial issues, and this will be related to the financial performance of a company and the complementarity. And this is what the EFRAG, the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, and what the IFRS is doing, the International Financial Reporting Standards. Right now, we have global regulatory discussions because this will impact us in Latin America. The first one is the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, which will prepare standards with a long list of environmental, social, and government issues, including climate information sharing. And then those standards were adopted a couple of weeks ago, and this was done with the cooperation of GRI. Secondly, IFRS, which are standards regarding to sustainability related to climate, and the ISSB, which consolidated the CDSB, and also the recommendations that are from the CDSB. And from March this year, we have been working with them because we're trying to provide more comparability and connection amongst the different standards. And finally, the Security Exchange Commission with the rule related to climate risks, and they are being discussed with other international players. There are also discussions with the European Union, Germany, and Switzerland, not to mention others. And now we also have the TCFD, which is also focused on biodiversity, and their standard version is in beta mode. So this was what started the work that we started doing with the IDB. How was the region before that? From the four important roles which could exist, from the emissions, the investors, regulators, and the market infrastructures and exchange rates. So there is a regulatory analysis on information in Latin America and the Caribbean. What is the current situation of regulation, the sustainability of regulations, and also we started seeing what they were informing about and how this was being regulated, how they were using the international standards. And we were also trying to see how were the standards with regard to disclosure, which are the challenges in order to go to better disclosure. Then we examined what investors are doing as users of sustainability information. Do they use this information? If they don't, why don't they use it? And when do they consult it in order to take decisions that are responsible? We looked at the role of market infrastructures in the dissemination of sustainability information, adhesion to international standards, the segment of thematic bonds, guidelines for the elaboration of sustainability report, and to see whether the exchanges have their own sustainability reports. And finally, we have recommendations on sectorial policies and the disclosure on sustainability so that regulators will understand that there are different levels of maturity in the region. When we say Latin America, there isn't just one Latin America with regard to the regulations of disclosure. This document, which is truly excellent, will be available in June of next year, but I would like to show you some of the findings, and I will start with this. According to investors, what are we still missing? The first challenge indicates that there is a multiple standards, and it is not clear that the standards are complementary. This challenge has been, we have been closing the gap on this challenge, and it will no longer then become a challenge, and there will be new challenges that will appear. Another one is the lack of clarity on material issues for each corporation. And we also see that another important challenge is the lack of regulation, which clarifies what is expected of the report. So these four big challenges in the region are also gaps that will be slowly closed. And we can imagine that in the future, there will be more information, clear regulation, clearer information, and much more clarity as to how the standards complement each other. In general, in this study, we see that there are joint responsibilities, but they are different between these four actors with regard to disclosure and different degrees of maturity depending on the country where they're situated. In Latin America, there are interesting developments, especially with regard to disclosure from issuers, but also challenges in quality, accessibility, and comparability of information. Some regulators have made some important progress with exercise to think about international trends, and it is important to make these exercises in more depth to generate capacity within the teams and give them the necessary resources for supervision. A minimum viable regulation should be considered for a disclosure of sustainability, international standards, clear conditions for those who are supervised depending on the maturity of each one of the markets. The investors in the region will start to get closer to ASG issues, but there are not only gaps in information, but also in the knowledge of the investment market and also ownership of their relationship and engagement. So when there is not enough information, this sector really has to take ownership on their engagement role. And finally, the recognition of the exchange, which have had an excellent exercise by promoting the voluntary disclosure under international standards, and they are now making an effort of compliance. This is all I will say, so we can continue with our discussions. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Andrea. We will all be awaiting the first quarter of 2023 to see all this information, which will without doubt will be very valuable. And we will now hear Arturo Rodriguez, who's a senior market leader for Ibero-America IFRS Foundation. Arturo, you have the floor. Thank you so much. I would like to share my presentation. I would like to thank CapiLAC for the invitation to talk to you about the work of the Council on International Standards on Sustainability, ISSB. As Andrea, I also have between 8 and 10 minutes to talk to you about this very important issue, and I will do my very best. I will start with this graph, which I'd like to present because it shows what is the role of IFRS, and this based on COP26 of last year when they announced the creator of the ISSB. The IFRS Foundation, as Diego mentioned, is this organization which for decades has been creating international financial disclosure standards to mention which information should be included for disclosure, and it has the International Accounting Standards Board, IASB. And since COP26 of last year, we started with ISSB, which will try to do the same thing, develop international standards of financial information, including sustainability, so as to include this information in the reports which are prepared for investors. So with the work of the two arms, IASB and ISSB, what IFRS is trying to do is to obtain complete information for investors and other capital providers, information for accounting purposes, and also information on sustainability, which can be of interest for investors. I would like to stress here that the NIF standards, which are required in more than 140 countries around the world today, and obviously with the creation of the new sustainability standards, it is to be hoped that these jurisdictions, which already require that public corporations should use NIIF, should also use the others so that there is a link between both. The objectives of the ISSB are quite clear. What we are trying to achieve is to create a global base of financial information standards on sustainability in order to satisfy the need of information for investors. Andrea was speaking about this duality, the material aspect and sustainability aspect, and we understand that investors want to know how sustainability has impact on corporations and how the value of their corporations can be affected by this. ISSB seeks to satisfy this information needs with regard to environmental, social, and governance issues, but also to allow corporations and preparers to present financial information in a useful and complete manner. And I hope that it will be clear is that this work is based on existing standards and frameworks. ISSB is taking what other organizations had been working up and had been promoting throughout the years, and we are developing these NIIS on sustainability. I also want to mention that ISSB is also trying to facilitate modularity with requirements which are specific for each jurisdiction or with the purpose of satisfying the needs of diverse audiences. We know that not only investors are interested in sustainability, but there are other audiences, other stakeholders who wish to know that, to see how corporations are doing from the point of view of ESG. And that is why ISSB is looking at this interoperability with other jurisdictions and with other types of audiences. I will now show you the concept of a global base, which I just mentioned. When I say global base, is something very abstract, but when I show you this illustration, I hope that you will be able to understand the concept better. What we are trying to do is to have a big block, if we think about Legos with which we all played, and we shall be able to add different types of concepts with regard to jurisdictions, with regard to sustainability. And as I mentioned before, if there are other players who are interested to find out about sustainability, in which this is in addition to what investors are interested in, this could be added to the global base of IFRS through the NIAS stores. This is in line with the concept of dual materiality issue. The global base is this information base, which is linked to the financial aspects, which can be obviously complemented by adding the impact issues, which are directed to investors and other stakeholders. Today, IFRS and ISSB have two standard projects which have already been published for public consultation. And we started off with two documents, and as we go along, there will be more of them. The first one is the draft NIAF S1 with the basic requirements, because it establishes general requirements regardless of what the corporation is working on. It just simply tells corporations how they should start thinking about the disclosure of information on sustainability. This document, NIF S1, seeks to get corporations to provide material information on sustainability, everything that is needed to assess the impact on sustainability. And this is enhancing the need to have a link between financial accounting information and sustainability information. This so that in the future, the information on accounting and sustainability shall be interlinked, and investors will be able to understand all the risks and opportunities faced by their organization. The second document is NIF S2, which is a thematic document because it's specifically focused on climate disclosure. In this document, we try to require organizations to provide material information on the risks and opportunities related to climate change, which will be necessary to assess its impact, the impact of climate change on the organization. This document in particular asks to talk about transition plans, about emissions, and also wants the organizations to speak about climate resilience. So they need to say how resilient they are. These two documents basically are a combination of two frameworks and standards which have been used for a long time. On the one hand, we have the recommendations of the TCFD, and the architecture of these two documents are based on the architecture which we already know. And what the SSEB does is take the first recommendations of TCFB and talk about sustainability and not only climate change. In NIF S1, we talk about general sustainability based on these four pillars. And in the second document, we specifically talk about climate change, and those four elements are taken into account, and they are the basis of the architecture to talk about climate change. These documents are also being developed based on SASB standards, which we know have been very successful in the past few years, including in Latin America, where today we have more than 200 corporations that are using these standards for their reports, including 30 corporations that are is one of the indexes, which is the most representative one at the local level, at the global level.
And I won't go into too much detail on this slide. It's just a definition of these four pillars that I was mentioning earlier. And these are the main elements of the sustainability NIF, and that's what it was about. Here, for the last couple of slides that I have for you, I wanted to talk about our next steps. for the IFRS. This is a draft that we have now. It was put out for public consultation, and many comments obviously were received from around the world. So we still need to finalize our deliberations on those comments that were received during the public consultation so that we can have these official NIF, these official regulations on sustainability. And IFRS in the first months of the next year, we'll put something out on digital taxonomy so that for us as users of this information can label the information digitally, so it will be much more useful and consumable through our technology. And also there will be a consultation on agenda priorities. Obviously, climate change is not the only priority on the agenda. There's biodiversity, nature, human rights, innovation, water, etc. And these need to be defined still, what the new standards for information will be. At COP27 a couple of weeks ago, the IFRS Foundation and ISSB launched a collaboration framework for the development of capacities in emerging markets, looking for an adoption of these NIFs on sustainability, and this is in Latin America, of course, in emerging markets. And the goal here is to prepare the ground, so to speak, to make the conditions adequate. And if we look at the number of countries that will be adopting the accounting NIFs, this will be over 140 jurisdictions. So we need to clear the path for these standards to be able to be adopted. And we do have Latin American representation in this initial group of organizations that will work on this collaboration. We have the Latin American group of issuers of information standards, GLENIF, and the Brazilian Institute of Corporate Governance, IBGC, will also be a part of this initiative at the Latin American level. And then finally, I'd like to conclude with a call to action for investors, for companies, and for any professional in accounting and sustainability. We need to become familiar with these draft standards, NIF S1 and S2, and also the IFRS Foundation and ISSB are really emphasizing that businesses need to begin to apply the TCFD recommendations and the integrated report framework and the SASB standards, because these will be used for building these NIF standards. So these three tools are important that we use them if we're not using them yet, so that we will be prepared for the future that is coming. And the counselors or advisors of ISSB will have monthly meetings to continue to talk about these documents, see what edits will be made, and we're beginning to already have on the horizon a final version. We also have a monthly podcast that we recommend. And that would be it for me. We can now begin our conversation. Thank you very much, Arturo, all that you have told us, and especially what's coming in the future. Very important. Now, if you agree, we have with us Kevin Cowan, Vice President for the Commission for the Financial Market of Chile. Go ahead, please. Thank you very much, Gemma. Thank you to the IDB and CapiLAC for this invitation. I'll share my screen now. Can you see it? Great. If you can confirm that you can see the screen and can hear me well? Yes, we can hear you. Well, thank you once again for this opportunity. And It's easy for me to give my presentation because it comes on the heels of two other excellent presentations. And so it will be clear what we are doing in our commission. So I will be going straight into the presentation. Just a point of information. This commission, we are an integrated supervisor. We have a mandate for financial stability and risk management, and we have a financial market mission, which is has to do with the conduct and protecting the market. We do have an agenda that is related to sustainability and climate change in particular. But both pillars have that mandate of development, so it's included in both of them. And I'll be focusing on conduct. And we've been working on reducing information asymmetries and promoting public goods for the use of investors in Chilean capital markets. So just wanted to make that clear. What has our commission done? We've tried to elevate the requirements in terms of a disclosure of information regarding sustainability, responding to the needs for information that investments have been expressing in the local market as well as in the global markets for some years already. Chile is a relatively large market, considering the region, and relatively small at a global level. So the importance of this information being disclosed is something we can see. It needs to be aligned with global standards. And what we find, or what we found 3 or 4 years when we started having this discussion, is that in fact, there was a lot of demand by institutional and non-institutional investors for this information, and willingness by the issuers to provide information, but a great variation in terms of the standards and information requirements, which made comparisons difficult by investors and made it difficult for issuers to understand how they should move forward. And now we've seen a convergence, and in the last few years, we've made some significant progress. But when we began this conversation, the situation was quite a bit more complex. So after a long public consultation process, 2 iterations of the regulation, common periods, working groups, in 2021, a standard was issued which modifies substantially the mandatory information requirements, and now includes a mandatory aspect for the disclosure of information having to do with environmental, social, and governance information for issuers of shares and other securities, and others such as banks, insurance companies, AGF, exchanges, among others. So it's a requirement that is applied quite broadly. And the progress here is that it includes an integrated report or annual report. So all these themes, ESG themes, are included throughout the report. And there was also a dialogue with several actors that are present here at this panel. And the idea was to align this proposal with what at the time and still so far are best international practices. The integrated report, TCFD in particular, regarding the metric of these 4 pillars for climate change, but broadened also to include social matters in general, GRI and SASB. So those were the ingredients, so to speak, that went into a regulatory proposal for our standard. And as has already been explained, several of these standards have converged, TCFD and SASB, for example, toward the standards of the proposal that ISSB is working on. So in this regard, we feel that we are well positioned to continue in this international dialogue. And one issue that was debated within the market and with investors has to do with materiality. And I think what had been the progress that had been provided, the progress that SASB provided was a main stepping stone in this case. And there are other matters that respond to more local concerns or continuity of information that was being requested for previous standards. So really, it was a very enriching debate with the various stakeholders. This, I believe, has already been mentioned by the other panelists, so I'll skip it. So to be very specific about what we did in Chile, I wanted to show you this slide, which is the table of contents, so to speak, of what needs to be reported in alignment with this new integrated report. Some are obvious and they come from the previous standard, but when we start talking about corporate governance, then companies have to provide information about this. Is their governance framework, their board of directors, its committees, and they have to include the topic of sustainability in the way that TCFD suggests. And when we came up with these principles that came out of the GRE of the Value Reporting Foundation, so we included them. Then there's a report on the strategy, medium-term strategy of the business, again, how they approach challenges and opportunities related to climate change and other social aspects. And again, this is all included in the report that they need to provide. There's a matter that had been discussed and debated in Chile before regarding people, diversity, inclusion, salary gaps. All of this is still there. It was present in the previous standard and it is still there. Then we go on to the business model. And the second matter that is of particular concern in the local market is the one that has to do with the management of suppliers. And here we're talking about sustainability in the management of these suppliers. So we broadened the information that was available through this second layer, our value chain, where actors have to report on their value chain as well. Then we have indicators that we took from SASB, taking advantage of the work that had already been done in this sector by them. And this is a reflection of financial reports and other aspects that were already present in the old standard. So very specifically, this is what our regulation requires. In parallel fashion to the norm or to the standard, some months ago, maybe some weeks ago, we published a guide for supervision and implementation, or oversight and implementation. And this is in response to comments from the industry regarding how to know exactly what information had to be provided, all the details of it. So that's why this guide was put out, following also international models. And so what we seek with this guide is to provide the elements for a better disclosure, to answer some questions that existed, to clarify where there was any question about the SASB standards. And some places this was not exactly adapted to local reality, so it was modified. So the idea is to make it easier to comply with the standard so that from the first reports to make sure that these are high quality, in particular for the use of investors who we understand require our services as financial supervisors, but there are others that can also take advantage of the information being generated through this standard. Operational details here. So far, what we've been doing is to use a PDF format for the report, and there's an electronic form where the SASB metrics can be reported on through XBRL, taking advantage of the investment that has already been made in XBRL by the company. And the idea is, as far as possible, to have a reporting system that makes it easier to provide ex post supervision, to compare, and so fulfill our role in the most economic way possible. And there was something else that was a part of the discussion with the various players in the industry, and it was a gradual timeline of implementation, a staged implementation. And here we had a question about the number of issuers who were registered. So we decided to implement this in a staggered way to take care of costs and other questions so that businesses could gradually reach this level of requirement. And we started with the largest companies in 2022 and 2023. We're coming down to a lower level, the open corporations. And then by 2024, we'll have all the rest of the corporations. These are the regulated financial institutions, insurance companies, and other entities that want to report information voluntarily. That's the schedule. What are our next steps? Let me try to hurry up so I don't take up more time than is necessary. Many of these next steps have to do with our challenges that we have in terms of monitoring or oversight. So we want to work towards a global vision of this, the provision of this information on sustainability, because this information enriches our focus on accounting information and what we glean from it, and the quality of the information on sustainability will be a significant indicator, we believe, regarding what we can focus on as a financial organization. And this will also help us in the long run, especially in the world of insurance, banks, and other financial institutions with a complementary function regarding these their role. So this is a significant challenge, but we're working on this, leaning on the experience that some already have in the private sector and the experience CMF already had regarding certain qualitative questions we had been asking even before on governance and on sustainability. More next steps, this aligned with what was said earlier. We're paying attention to how the ISSB is evolving, and also global accounting standards. And depending on the changes we see, we feel that our standards are based on a solid skeleton, so to speak, a solid foundation. So we don't anticipate huge changes, but of course we're paying attention to how the work of the ISSB evolves, and we want to automatize and standardize information to facilitate comparisons, analyses, and the comparative use by investors. And this is on the aspect of information. And there's another matter that I think has been very interesting in Chile. There's been a debate around the standard regarding compliance, but also regarding risk analysis within governing boards, how this is structured. And I think this is perhaps ultimately one of the most relevant goals of this, beyond disclosure, which of course provides information that gives more resources to the market so that we can have better governance systems. And already this is generating a lot of debate in local fora regarding these aspects. And I think that's already a benefit that we've seen from this norm.
We're also discussing publicly what will be done with green taxonomy, and we have up to now working with the IDB with regard to next steps. And finally, another issue which is of concern to us are ESG issues, especially the disclosure of funds that are being used, and we are working on a regulatory agenda to improve the disclosure of sustainability risks in the investment documents, the development and implementation of practices. And as we start having drafts, as we have done with the draft for the preceding norm, we will put it out for public consultation so that retail investors who are not qualified, who are not institutional, who acquire these funds should have the required information to minimize the risk of greenwashing. So this is our agenda, our next steps in the short term. With these words, thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you so much, Kevin. In order to finish with the last presentation, I give the floor to Olga Cantilla, who is the president of FIAB. Thank you so much, Gemma. I was asked to talk in this panel about the challenges that we have with the creation of indices for our markets, the classification of thematic bonds, and I would like to answer this question from the FIAB and to talk a little bit about my institution briefly. FIAB was created 49 years ago. We have 24 members of the exchanges in Latin America, the Caribbean, and Spain, and we have a working group. The working group, in turn, has working subgroups. We have one on technology, cybersecurity, trading in cooperation with AXA, alternative products, and one that is also very important, which is the sustainability subgroup. And we have been working on several aspects. One which I would like to mention it because it is related to the answer to the question that was asked. One survey that we carried out with our members with regard to sustainability in 2021 and 2022 so as to understand at which time or which measures our members are adopting, which when they participate in associations, federations, do they disseminate information, whether they disclose information voluntarily or in a compulsory matter. And I would like to share some of the results. From the response and participation of our members, 12 belong to the sustainability group. 13 of our members belong to the Initiative of Sustainable Exchange of the United Nations. 16 are somehow promoting sustainable finance in their markets, and 20 of our members have either guidelines or principles for the issuance of thematic bonds and for the dissemination of information. 8 of our members have a matrix of material aspects, and 9 have sustainability reports annually. In most cases, they coincide with GRI standards. With regard to sustainability indexes, we have 5 of our members, BIMA and MAE, which is the electronic open market, the Spanish exchange B3, Brazil, and the Lima exchanges. And one of them is the index of the IDB Index America. And we also have the FTSE of IBEX Gender Equality. We have the one of S&P in Brazil and in Lima, amongst others. So of the 24, only 5 have sustainability indexes. It's a rather low number, but what do we glean from the results of this survey? and there is a smaller participation in the recent survey we carried out. One of it is that we need to take action which is directed to cooperation with global associations and federations. We have cooperation with the ISSA, the SSE, the United Nations Initiative, where we have translated into Spanish some of the guidelines for sustainability, and a recent one which was translated into Spanish about the OSG 5 in capital markets, which we will launch in December. We also work in workshops, in webinars directed to study these issues. For instance, with regard to the invitation that we received by IDB recently to discuss the issues during the issuance of this type of values. And we recently prepared an MOU with the World Federation of Exchanges in order to cooperate amongst these federations. One of them is the issue on sustainability. Coming back to the results of the survey, one of the questions asked was which were the obstacles to introduce sustainability in the markets. Our members said priority of short-term benefits versus long-term benefits, a high resistance to change, the lack of acceptance within and outside our organizations with regard to the relevance of sustainability, create capacity within the institutions, and also legal and economic issues. For instance, the benefits of this type of issues, and also the disclosure of information, which are challenges for our wings. I do not want to repeat this because Andrea and Arturo spoke about this already and very well. The need to standardize everything that is related to the disclosure. In the beginning, we were a little bit overwhelmed by the different standards that existed at the global level. Which ones should we meet? So these standardizations, which has been mentioned, will be very positive to meet this challenge. The issue that we need to educate and promote all stakeholders, from issuers, so that they will know what is relevant and must be disclosed, for investors, what information do they require in order to make responsible investments at retail level or at institutional level, the infrastructure of the market to see which information we must or must not demand from our members in a voluntary way. And we are seeing that there is a trend of the compulsory requirement of this information. Something that I find very important is that in these exercises that have taken place and where I have participated, there is a need to close this gap because it has to do with what I mentioned. As long as we do not educate, promote, and standardize issues, it will be very difficult to obtain something to improve the lack of information. I will give you a very specific example right now. The SSE, in cooperation with IFC, carried out a review of the exchanges from the G20 and Latin America. I am going to speak about the Latin American one, which was the main challenge to obtain public information. The results of this study would be very different if we had more information. And the information that is publicly available in the exchanges, in the centrals, and for our own issuers. So how can we take measures in order to promote, educate, and see how the disclosure has to take place? How should it be available in our web pages or in the dissemination of our informs so that this information can be publicly accessed by investors or any other stakeholders? They need to have a data repository, and this is why we launch a survey to our members to see where should this information be published, but not only published information, but also the quality of the information so that it can meet its objective. So that is to have data about what our peers are doing, which measures have they taken, and which issues have resulted in sustainable financing in their markets, and to maintain this information up to date. And this is how we arrived to the webpage of FIAB, where we have information for our members. But this is a challenge because the challenge has to be easily comparable and the information must be easy to update. So we continue working on this in the Sustainability Working Group of FIAB. In conclusion, and so as not to take too much time because we are already over the time for the panel and perhaps you wish to have some time to talk, I would like to repeat what Andrea and Arturo said. The issue of standardization is very important. Education, promotion, having information that is publicly accessible so that our stakeholders will recognize easily which are the benefits of having these issues and the benefits for investors, which is what make us commit to sustainable development from the market. Gema, I give the floor back to you to conclude this panel or to share experiences from the members. Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to you, Olga, for sharing all this information about the reports that you are about to publish. We have very little time available, so I would like to ask 2 or 3 questions, and if you do not mind, I would request that the answers are brief because we are short of time. We will start with Andrea. If she could please tell us what is the experience of investors with regard to everything that has to do with disclosure on sustainability and what will happen next year. Can you please very briefly tell us what is the view of investors? Thank you so much. I will share the results that we have. What we found was that the investors in Latin America, not necessarily at the world level, is that there is a paradigm change in the markets because investors need to have a more active role in the financing of development and somehow finance this transition. Investors in Latin America are maturing in their understanding of ESG in investment decisions, and they are understanding better that this does not necessarily mean that they have to sacrifice the yield, but it will allow them to assess investments from a more expanded point of view, and also based on what the SSC of the United Nations, there are at least 250 signatories. So there is an increase, at least in the interest generated. We need to translate the interest in concrete action and in concrete work with regard to their relationships. First of all, is from the investor's point of view, what information I would like to have. And then we look in detail into the scenarios where we do have information and we find a perfect scenario for information, but there is a gap in the knowledge of local investors to be able to understand what they are receiving. Since the recommendation is about to be published, what we realize that it will not be enough for the investors. They will not be able to say, I don't have information, there is no standardization, because we already have that. So they will have to catch up and they will have to generate the capacity in their analysts so that this can be translated in policies, and because they have to engage at the market level with the corporations, and there should be different conversations between investors and corporations in the region. There are interesting examples at the international level, and these examples can inspire what happens in the region because there is an important gap. Final thing, it is important for this information to be public And investors should not be requesting more and more surveys with information that should already be public for ESG. So the public information should be there. So we should not send 20 or 25 different ESG questionnaires asking the same thing. So by increasing the knowledge level of analysts, we should have different conversations. So the cup is half full, but there is still a lot of things to be done in order to generate conscience and have concrete action related to ESG. This is very important for investors. They not only have to talk about climate change, but they also need to integrate social criteria because social issues in Latin America are fundamental and they should lose the fear of social issues. Thank you. Very well. Thank you, Andrea. The next question very quickly for Arturo. This is a question from the public. Which entities does ESSB regulations apply? Are they hoping for a great acceptance of this? And if so, when? Thank you, Gema. The reply about the adoption, as I mentioned during the presentation today, we have the drafts, and we think that we will have the final version during the first half of 2023. In the accounting world, the IFRS through IASB develops these standards at the global level, creating consensus during public consultation periods, and then the standard is adopted at the global level. But in order for this global norm or standard to go down to the regional or jurisdictional level, each regulator within a jurisdiction has to review the standards and comment on it, on its applicability before it requires its use within their jurisdiction. So IFRS, IASB, and ESSB are only standard setters which create a global standard, but they do not have the power to remake these standards compulsory in their jurisdiction. So this question is a question for the regulators of each jurisdiction who are looking at these standards within the boundaries of each country, each sector, to see when they should be published and when they will become compulsory for corporations in their countries. What I can say is that the final version of the two documents we're working on will be ready sometime in the first half of 2023, and then each jurisdiction will have to decide how they review it and what is their procedure in order to implement it in each country. Thank you. Thank you so much, Arturo. And the last question very quickly to Kevin. After the steps taken with regard to FSP and the SSAB standards, which are the next steps which will be taken from the point of view of the Chilean market? Thank you so much for the question, Gemma. There are two steps. The first one, obviously, is to pay attention to the evolution of normal standards, see when this is published next year, and to assess whether it is convenient for us to close the gap with that standard. The speed of this will depend on the gaps and on the experience which we should have had after a first round of implementation of our standards. And the second issue,
there's a second issue. We think we can continue to clarify and improve the regulations in Chile regarding the information given to investors to invest through funds, mutual funds, investment funds. And so we want to clarify the requirements so that funds may or may not agree with the ones for responsible investment. If they do, they can label it as such, and this will be information will be provided to the investors. I think that's an initiative we have. Those are the two most imminent steps to complete the set of information that we'd like to be able to hand an investor directly to a business or through funds. Thank you very much. I just want to thank everyone, Andrea, Olga, Arturo, and Kevin for giving us this very broad perspective of what is taking place in terms of taxonomy and transparency with the objective of promoting the development of sustainable finances in Latin America and the Caribbean. Here we conclude our panel. Thank you again to the panelists as well as to those of you who have joined us. And we hope that this panel has been interesting for you. Thank you very much. Hema, great moderation. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you, Kevin, Andrea, Arturo, and Olga. What is clear is that the entire sector, including issuers, investors, market infrastructure, everyone has a task in terms of disclosure, and the standardization that ISSB will offer will put us in a better position to be able to adopt regulations at the local level. So there's a task for regulators there as well, and you'll have the support of the IDB for the implementation of these new regulations. Now we have a panel that I think is so exciting. It's the carbon market panel. The carbon market is a unique opportunity for the region. We believe that there's no doubt that this is the future of the financial sector. And if we did not talk about this at CapiLAC, it would truly be a sin. So we've brought a panel of experts. And we also have an expert moderator, Maria Neto. She has many years of experience in the financial sector. She has worked with us in our connectivity and markets and finance division for years, and now she's working as the main advisor to the Department of Institutions for Development for the manager there, and she's in charge of many topics as an advisor, and she's internationally recognized, and she could be a panelist herself practically, but I think we want to take advantage of her talent as a moderator as well for this panel. So I leave Maria with you and our panelists. Go ahead, Maria. Thank you very much, Diego. We have a spectacular panel. Let's just introduce our panel. Going back to Juan Ketterer's words when he opened up the session, this is a very particular time that we are facing with the need for decarbonization and the need to fulfill certain goals and the ambitions stemming from the Paris Agreement, so we can eventually have net zero emissions. The carbon market is not a panacea, but it is an opportunity, a unique opportunity for the region, because our region has the greatest potential in the world in terms of potential emission reductions through projects such as reforestation, land use projects, and activities in support of nature. And it can also be a great opportunity for our industries where we still need to decarbonize, where we can also compensate for part of its emissions. So we have a very important panel today. This market has been growing tremendously. Last year, the compliance market, it's the regulated market, and this is seen more in Europe, China, and or other jurisdictions. The regulated market we have in our region is only in Mexico so far, Colombia moving in that direction, but the regulated market has grown 160%, almost $8 billion now. And the voluntary market, it's incipient, it's now grown to $2 billion, and it is expected to grow 30-fold. So our region has been seeing some efforts on this, but there's also concern the structure of this market and the market potential it has goes hand in hand with the capacity that governments will have to regulate how the market will operate, to ensure that this market has a minimal level of financial integrity in particular, so that we know how to manage these assets and to have the sufficient transparency so that any player in the market can participate in it. If we want to scale up this market potential, we need a much higher level of transparency and clarity. And that's why I love having this group today. We will talk about this and the market infrastructure that we need to develop from different points of view in order to grow and sustain this market. I'll start with Mariana Escobar, who will tell us a bit about Colombia's experience in developing green taxonomies, and in particular, why this is important in raising awareness precisely in businesses, in the various actors in the market regarding how to commodify projects and how to disclose information about emissions. Welcome, Mariana, you have the floor. Thank you, Maria. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to the IDB for this invitation. It's always a pleasure to work with you. We've been sharing our experiences with you for a few years. For those who don't know, Colombia has very ambitious goals regarding mitigation and adaptation. We went from last year from emissions at 20%, reduction of 20% of greenhouse gases to a 50% reduction, and that's quite an ambitious goal. Also, Colombia committed to be carbon neutral by 2050. We have our prior environment minister here who already talked. And we realize that we will need public resources, but also private capital in order to reach these very significant environmental goals. And they're so important for the world. As last year, we recognized among the businesses that we oversee the opportunity that exists to mobilize this capital to develop businesses that support this goal. And these will become decisive in our transition. And so one of the elements we found, one of the main strategies that we see in terms of our interventions for our sustainability framework or to green our system. So part of that strategy was this taxonomy. At the superintendents, we asked the entities that we oversee, what are the main barriers for mobilizing capital? And they said it was a lack of common definitions, a system of information and labels. They wanted to know what was the greenest or how to find the assets and activities and projects that were green in Colombia as they reduce their costs as well. Credit institutions, and the biggest ones, of course, have an installed capacity for teams that have expertise. But when we talk about smaller financial entities or other participants in the capital market or smaller issuers, that capacity was not there. And the lack of some kind of system to help them identify what is green, what helps them contribute, well, that was a barrier to them not having that. So we decided to get started with a project, the green taxonomy for the country. And from the perspective of this, of our business, of our office, rather, the financial superintendents, we knew that we needed to provide some response that aligned with what was happening globally. We didn't want to reinvent the wheel. No need to be too innovative, only in those circumstances when we needed to be, but we did want to take some existing models. So we took as a basis other international experiences from the European initiative, what had been developed in local institutions, and the monitoring and the report verification on expenses on climate change. So we used all of this as a basis. And these activities and assets were screened according to their economic relevance or relevance to the country, employment, value added, but also the potential they have to help us with our mitigation objectives. So those sectors were already contributing to the mission. So after that, we ended up with about 90 activities and ultimately 40 according to the availability of information, standards, local regulations, or local practices. And we had a number of criteria. And this is what Maria was saying. When we began to define those technical criteria and that technical or environmental performance, that was a first step in raising awareness on how to use indicators or environmental performance indicators for something that can be financed eventually by investors. So this taxonomy was based on these eligibility criteria as a sort of foundation for that initial raising of awareness so that participants in financial markets could begin to understand and identify those projects that would contribute substantially. And what's relevant about this taxonomy for Colombia and can be joined with the development of carbon markets is that what is there are those activities that contribute in a substantive way. It's not an exhaustive list. It's a significant contribution. How are they really contributing to mitigation on the greenhouse gases? And the taxonomy in this first phase is being implemented through pilot projects. We're understanding how financial entities can incorporate this taxonomy into their credit origination strategies and how they can track these expenses. And I think this can help create and generate capacities within these institutions to understand where possible projects and opportunities reside. So this is the first implementation through pilot projects and through requirements or regulatory instructions linked to certain elements such as a green bond. But we acknowledge that this is not enough in order to mobilize capital and debt instruments. Even if they're aligned with the taxonomy, it's not enough to mobilize enough capital. So at the financial superintendents, we understand that we need to monitor developments that are taking place locally in the development of carbon markets. And I know our former minister will talk about this later. We've made a great effort to develop and increase credibility. That's being done right now. Integrity from the environmental perspective on in voluntary markets, and there's also regulation of markets. But in any case, we are currently participating and being active in the discussion regarding these exercises, these initiatives, because we believe that in order to truly create an attractive market so that financial actors will want to participate in these markets. As you said, Maria, we need to make sure we have financial integrity. One of the main debates that we're having today, beyond the idea of how to identify an asset or an activity and for it to have actually real environmental performance. Beyond that, we have a discussion on the legal nature of the credit, and that becomes a main topic. There are some proposals from those who want to be flexible and leave that legal nature not so strictly defined. But then there's a proposal that we've put on the table. We feel that it is important to clearly define what the legal nature is, be much more specific. Is it a security or an asset? And this will facilitate credibility in the markets. And there's something else, and I think, Maria, you mentioned it when we were talking about the participation of the panel. In conclusion, and just to bring it back to taxonomy. In the implementation of taxonomies, we have great challenges, but there are two that are the main ones, a conceptual one and an operational one. Conceptually, part of what we look at when we're developing taxonomies and their implementation is how complex and how ambitious is what we ended up in the end. And in the pilots, we see that the level of ambition may not be the highest. What remain there responds to a local context. And what we have seen and where the main challenges are in terms of implementation have to do with operations. The data you have to collect, the information you have to collect in order to ensure compliance. And here we have a big challenge. I think this would become a precondition for us to have a much more transparent market so that we can invest in projects that can contribute to mitigation. Thank you very much, Mariana. That's an excellent example of how when you start with a taxonomy, you can raise awareness in the actors, with the actors, but also we need to support transparency, efficiency in the market. And there are also those milestones that we see all over the place. And regarding transparency, Pedro Gurrola will tell us about the point of view of those who are trying to promote the disclosure of information about how these credits and how this market is operating and what the role is that we see, Pedro, that exchanges or platforms can have. And I've been asked here to try to answer within 7 minutes because we're running short on time. Thank you. Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you to CapiLAC for inviting me today. This is an opportunity to express the point of view of the global exchanges, the World Federation of Exchanges, rather. So just first an explanation of what we do at the World Federation of Exchanges. We represent over 200 market infrastructures, including securities and derivatives markets, clearing houses, and the global nature of the association allows us to have a very interesting perspective on what is happening in different regions, as the situation in every different region, if we look at the fact that there are different regulations, rules, different geographic environments, this can lead to very different scenes. But what's interesting is that despite this diversity of perspectives among our members, there's been a constant effort to continue with the initiatives toward sustainability. We have a report, an annual report that we publish where we collect information through a survey of all of our members about their initiatives on sustainability, including, for example, carbon markets that some of them offer. And we're also sort of a thermometer on how different products can attract more or less demand from investors. And this is another very significant and important role. I think in the particular case of Latin America, the issue of carbon markets is tremendously important for the region, as you've already mentioned, Maria, because there's such huge potential. There's a huge reserve of natural resources. There's a need for reforestation. The sale of carbon certificates can generate a flow of capital for projects to capture carbon from the atmosphere and to develop new technologies that are commercially viable. And something else that I think is very important is that all these projects, usually most of them, have positive externalities, meaning that a project that is devoted to reducing carbon emissions usually also has an impact in terms of improving the lives of a sector of the population, improving the quality of water or the quality of air, for example. So this means that for our countries in the Latin American regions, it's particularly important to be able to access these markets and take full advantage of the trend that we see and the growth that these allow for. You also mentioned, Maria, some numbers that predict that the demand for carbon credits will increase 15-fold or even more by 2030. And the expected increase by 2030 in terms of value will be about $2 billion. It will go up to about 50 billion. So the opportunities are there and we need to pay attention to them.
From the regulatory point of view, we see that there is specific interest in fostering these markets. This as a consequence of COP26 and COP27. We have seen how regulators are more and more interested in facilitating and creating an adequate framework to help these markets to flourish in a healthy and competitive manner. A few weeks ago, IOSCO published a consultation on the future of carbon markets, those that are regulated and those that are voluntary, and they are trying to facilitate the best way to develop these markets. In any case, there are lessons to be learned based on what happened in the past, and there are many problems to be solved. The road is not clear. For instance, I think that we have to pay special attention to the design and implementation of the market to avoid situations where there is an artificial volatility, as has been the case when there was a lack of balance between supply and demand in the European market 10 years ago, a situation of lack of balance between supply and demand, which can artificially make prices drop. And this volatility is a result to a defect in the market design. So the market design is fundamental. And coming back to your question, I think that exchanges have a lot to offer because, as we well know, a successful market, not only the carbon one, does not only require to have liquidity, transparency, and solid governance, which inspires investors. These are characteristics that are required in order to generate a process that is efficient. And this happens and will happen largely because exchanges have knowledge about how to structure a market. It is also important to take into account that exchanges should provide information. There should be an information source so that investors may take optimal decisions based on their investment interests. And this is something that markets and exchanges have a lot of experience in how to feed the financial ecosystem by providing the information that they produce as part of the transaction platforms. A third aspect, which I would like to point out, where exchanges can contribute, I don't want to speak too much, there are other points, but it is standardization, which has already been mentioned. Standardization is a serious problem currently in voluntary carbon markets, and it is fundamental not only to bring liquidity, but also for the scalability of the carbon market. So exchanges have the capacity and the possibility of making progress towards a greater standardization of the market, and that is another element with which they can contribute to the development of such markets. Efficient ecosystem, transparency, governance, scalability, these are all elements which, in my view, could be brought about by the exchanges. And this is all I will say for now, and we can continue with our conversation later on. Thank you so much, Pedro. Excellent link between the need for regulation and the complementarity of exchanges. And this is an important problem which we see in the voluntary market. A lot is over the counter. There is very little information about prices and also the contractual conditions. And this can lead to serious problems in the market as if we do not change the way things are done. I will now give the floor to Carlos Eduardo, since Mariana has already spoke, talking about voluntary markets. I would like him to talk about some things that have already been started in Colombia, which provide a little bit more certainty about these markets and help to define the nature of credit and to increase transparency. Carlos Eduardo, please.
Muchas gracias, María, y un saludo.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Maria. Special greetings to Mariana. I always love to listen to her because she has carried out an extraordinary work in all financial matters, especially with green taxonomy. Thanks to Pedro, to Tatiana, to Diego, of course, Diego Herrera. Thank you so much. I would always like to start from the beginning because I have been listening carefully to all the panel participants. We've talked about biodiversity, about climate change, about financing, about capital markets. Juan Antonio spoke about the risk. And each one, all of this integrated constitutes a market. In 2015, within the Paris Agreement, 195 countries signed the agreement, and we established a measure which is the most important of all, which is the measure of carbon. Carbon has a price, and this is why a market was launched. Global warming, without doubt, is not a trend, it is a reality. In academia, sometimes we talk about trends. It is not a trend, it's a reality, and it will continue growing. Maria mentioned this 30%. And this is going to grow. We do not have enough supply. And in 2016, we created a tax on carbon. And this was the important step. In 2017, this carbon tax had a very important characteristic, which is the tax of non-causation, which has been very important for the impact that Colombia has had on markets. And thereafter, we started working and enlarging this voluntary market, which started based on the carbon tax within the Paris Agreement. In 2015, as Mariana said, we established a measurement, which is the NNDCs, which are the nationally determined contributions. Colombia at that time committed to reduce its gases by 20% to 2030, and these NDCs are updated regularly. On 2020, we did update this, and we also have adaptation measures included in our NDC. And we increase this target to 51% by 2030. So the carbon market here has a fundamental role because there are mitigation actions, circular economy, sustainability, but also the fight against deforestation, which is 31% of the greenhouse gases. So our challenge is to increase our capture capacity, fighting against deforestation, reduce and decrease deforestation, but also to have important capture systems, not only with the best technology that we have today, which are the trees, but also with new technologies. So today, Maria, I can give you figures. Since 2017, when we started the carbon tax, we have had 508,050 requests, which is the equivalent of a very large amount of tons which were compensated via the system. And on the other hand, the tons that were caused, which represent more than $200 million. And these are invested in a National Environment Fund, which is used for these mitigation adaptation actions and also for losses and damages, as we saw in COP27, where a fund was created for losses and damages. So we have very important challenges today. we have to have a national register of emissions in Colombia, which needs to be strengthened to get better technology. Technology today is fundamental for what you were mentioning now, that green taxonomy, to be able to follow up traceability, transparency, integrity. And Colombia has been working in an articulate way. Today, we are in a CapiLAC forum of financial market, capital markets, which have an important role in the carbon market. The climate change also, biodiversity as well. We are not today in a biodiversity or climate change forum. So all this is linked. In Colombia, we created a Ministry of Climate Change where all the actors and all the ministers have to sit down once a month to review the figures, and there is a sectoral commitment. And we also approved in 2021 a law of climate change in December 2021, which incorporates all the commitments of the NDCs and at the same time makes us mature and regulate the market faster, the regulatory market and the voluntary market. So we need to strengthen institutional capacity, governance, and many challenges with regard to safeguards with communities. So communities are the ones that are in the territory developing these type of projects. So it is not only a market. The market is born in order to lower the temperature of the planet, which is the crisis that we have today. And based on this, we need to decrease global warming and stop it. And that is why there is a price on carbon, and that price has developed a new market, a new economic, social, and environmental market. The exchange is going to be a fundamental actor from now on, but we're also talking about climate financing. Mariana, for instance, were mentioning that we signed a pact with the Banking Association. The banks committed to finance 40% of NDCs with private resources. So these are new lines of credit because there is a green taxonomy, and these lines of credit will have the needed requirements, and we will have greater traceability. So we have been developing the market in an appropriate way, but demand is growing a lot faster than supply, and not only the capital markets and the financial market, but the human capital as well. We will require a lot of people with knowledge in these issues. In the certifiers, the international organizations require more people who have knowledge, and we have a very important gap where we do not have all these people. So we need to continue. In Colombia last year, and up to July 2022, there were already 1,000 corporations that had agreements with the Ministry of the Environment. And this is very important because the private sector will have better knowledge when the regulated markets arrive. So we have very little time by 2030. So there is a voluntary market, there is a regulated market, which has already been created. The law that we have adopted in 2021, which has fostered this quick development, and now there will, in 2023, we will have all the regulation, and we have convened the PMI with the World Bank, with all the support that the World Bank has provided to the Colombian state. In 2023, we will have the regulation in 2024, the first pilot program, and by 2025, this is all going to be working. So it is very important that the private sector should have this in place, and public policy has to be agile, and financing for climate, which now makes us think that we have to think about PPOs, because we see that taking care of nature and the forest generates income. So we need to have financing, not only from the multilateral banks, but the private sector, international cooperation, and the funds that have been created for at least $100 billion, which were established through the Paris Agreement. These financing has to come down, and Colombia is ready with its green taxonomies. And one issue for the future, because this is not the right place to do it, we need a lot of technology. Blockchain is necessary in order to be able to have the integration transparency that is required, and that is a very important challenge, which will be a cross-cutting for the entire market. Thank you so much. This is a very interesting example of Colombia. If we had more time here, we would have to have more time for that, to show how, by recognizing the fact that there is non-complying, the offsetting has stimulated a voluntary market, and this was done as a transition in order to reach a compliance market. So it is very interesting to create incentives. But as you well said, it is need to be cross-cutting, and this is important for our countries. It is important to bring all the players, ministries, the exchange, the financial market, regulatory agencies, and local capacity to finance the projects. In order to close our panel, I will give the floor to Tatiana Suarez to speak to us from the European perspective. In Europe, they have been implementing projects from the compliance market, which is the greatest compliance market in the world, and also they are a very important investors in the carbon market. Lessons learned that we can consider here for the region. Tatiana, you have the floor. Thank you, Maria. Thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. Excellent panelists. I learned a lot during these past sessions. I am Tatiana Suarez. I am an analyst of carbon market in the compliance market in Europe. I work for Refinitiv, which is part of the London Stock Exchange Group. As Maria said, the compliance market in Europe, it is the largest in the world. In 2021, we had 12 billion tons of carbon. I am going to speak today about the challenges and specificities of this market. I will speak about carbon markets in theory and practice. In this first slide, I show you the structure of my presentation. I will first be talking about the pieces of a puzzle which may be considered for the compliance market. Then I will be speaking about price signals, especially with regard to the electricity market, which are needed to drive investment to cleaner energy. And finally, I will compare different results that have been found in different countries of Europe in the electric grids. This first slide is possibly the most important one. I chose about 8 of the important or most important elements of the design of the compliance market in Europe. First, we have the sectors. The market in Europe has about 80 or 90% is made up of industrial energy that generates electricity. And we also include industries that are intensive users of energy, and also public heating or district heating, as we call it. On the other hand, we have the profiles of reduction. These are the ambitions for reduction. And in Europe, we also have carbon neutrality, net zero by 2050. This needs to be reflected in the cap, which is the part of the reduction of emissions.
Then we also have safety valves. When this market started in the first years, too many permits were issued. So in 2015, the Market Stability Reserve was introduced. It's a mechanism that allows for control on how many permits are out in the market at a particular time. The phases are different, as the previous panelist mentioned. For example, in the first period, there was a test period, a pilot period. Then there are periods where there are different levels of ambition and different regulations, different rules. Then we also have the carbon leakage. These are the regulations that protect the industry from emissions going to other countries or other parts of the geography. And then there's whether the funds will be reinvested or not. That's the purpose of the revenues section. And then in terms of the market expansion, we want to make it, do we want to make it compatible with other markets? This graph, I'm sorry. This graph shows the power generation margins for gas and for carbon. So what I was trying to show, or what we were trying to reach, is to have the orange line above the gray line, but that has not been achieved throughout all of the years during which the market has been in operation, in particular in the last few years with the Ukraine crisis. Gas prices have increased substantially, so the power generation margins for gas have been negative. And this means that carbon generation rises comparatively. Next slide. Here we have the same graph, but with greater detail for the last few years. The gray line, that's carbon, as you see, is above those generated by the gas energy industry. Next slide. In this graph, we have what we call the CO2 fuel switch. That's the price that the carbon permit needs to have, so that there's that switch from carbon to gas. So we've seen that the carbon price has not always been high enough for this switch to take place. Next slide. Here we have an example of the power generation mix in the last few years in Europe. We've seen that has been a slight reduction of emissions or of generation, but it has been to a great extent a result of energy efficiency rather than a reduction in the use of fossil fuels. And then in the UK, we did see a reduction in carbon combustion. That's the brown part of the bar. The UK established a tax on top of the permits that were necessary and regulated. And in this way, it was able to phase out carbon combustion generation. Next. And then here we have Poland. We see that there's been a relatively small amount of progress in any changes in the black, brown, and gray lines. These are the ones for gas, carbon, and lignite. In Germany, the situation is more mixed. There's been efficiency and more of a share of clean energies based on solar or wind energy, but at the same time, the policy of reducing nuclear power generation has meant that gas and carbon have been maintained at a certain level in the country. So with this presentation, I was trying to show that it's not enough to just have that signal based on the price of carbon. There also need to be other signals for investors so that they will invest in cleaner technologies. For example, the price of electricity needs to be high enough to maintain a certain level of revenue during these periods. Thank you very much. And the pricing of carbon is very important, as you said, not just vis-a-vis goals, but also vis-a-vis investment plans in terms of changing the entire matrix, because offsets for carbon, you need to change the matrix itself and make that part of businesses strategy. And now in Europe, it's not an easy situation. They're depending more on gas. They're even, for now, going back to carbon, to coal. So it's looking more difficult for renewables. I have just received a question for Mariana, which is more related to the initial question on taxonomy, and it's about the legal framework, Mariana, that was established for the sustainability and social green bonds. This taxonomy that was developed and the regulatory framework that you developed, is there anything that's unique about it, or do you just use market mechanisms or just a current taxonomy? The taxonomy that you developed, what does it look like currently? And is it being used to stimulate bonds as well? And I think this goes for the carbon market as well. Thank you for the question. Yes, during the different interventions that we've made regarding the strategy to green our system, it's not just taxonomy. There are other interventions that have been made, but we want to do it progressively, do it gradually, do it in a cumulative way, providing space for the participants so they can understand expectations, so they can gain the knowledge and the know-how and the capabilities they need. So for the taxonomy, we made a decision that the implementation was going to start with these pilot projects and in a parallel way with the regulations regarding disclosure. But this was not a corporate, corporate was not being included, because I know in Europe it's about corporate disclosure. In Colombia, it's about products, starting with thematic bonds, but also sustainable performance bonds, and it's all referenced. What is the focus? It's not fully, but there's a bit of a comply or explain ability. So we asked investors, whether it's bonds or funds administration, which have some kind of green or sustainability promise, to disclose whether they're aligned with Colombia's green taxonomy and to what extent. We don't expect 100% alignment. And we don't think it should be a precondition, because the open taxonomy has certain environmental goals, but the assets that are prioritized for the first phase respond to the need for climate mitigation. And we want to give the market time to understand. So that regulation for green bonds is structured around the principles, use of funds. For that, we ask referencing to the taxonomy. Thank you. To conclude our panel, I'll start with you, and then I'll go to the next, the rest of the panelists. Just 1 minute from your point of view. What are the things, in your case, Mariana, what do you think is the main topic? You talked about the importance of the legal nature of this. What milestones do you see, even in Colombia that has made a bit more progress than other countries? What is it important for us to focus on in CapiLAC, in capital markets? What can we look at and focus on for our agenda? I wanted to ask your opinion about that. And then I'll ask Pedro, Carlos, Eduardo, and Tatiana 1 minute each to answer the same question from your perspective. If you could all turn on your cameras. Thank you. I'll start. I know we don't have a lot of time. So in addition to what I said about the legal nature, there's another component that supervisors and regulators of capital markets think is central, in its transparency. How do we avoid greenwashing? And I link that to carbon markets through net zero commitments. We have a lot of companies that are beginning to make commitments for carbon neutrality. And as financial supervisors, we need to maintain and ensure the integrity and transparency of those commitments. To the extent that these are serious commitments, we will be generating more local demand for these carbon markets. We know a lot of it comes from abroad. We want to attract that, but locally it's important for that interest to develop as well. And that's another important aspect, another component in this chain or this ecosystem of carbon markets where supervisors can contribute and start to move that threshold so we develop in a better way. Thank you very much, Mariana. Pedro. I totally agree with what Mariana has just said. The matter of the regulations, of the legal structure is important, and the exchanges can and should play an important role. But this is an issue for an entire ecosystem that needs to be created with the participation of all agencies, certification entities, of all the actors that are currently involved in these markets. We need to design and create a market that is efficient. And what's most important ultimately is for there to be liquidity for the investors as well as the issuers to be able to meet in a platform that offers them what they're looking for, and for the benefits for all to go to the people and for the natural resources that we're trying to preserve and protect in the region. Thank you very much. Thank you, Maria. Just wanted to echo what Mariana and Pedro have just said. When you go to on-site and talk to people, double accounting or dual accounting and transparency, these are some of the concerns and safeguards for the communities as well. I think there will be a fundamental role to be played here by education, dialogue, communication, to ensure that integrity that we need. And so the communities on the ground, especially the most vulnerable ones, will have guarantees. So we really need to work on that to be able to ensure that the market works, coming from the grassroots level up. And I'm talking just about forestry projects and others, but of course there are other types of projects that will grow. But in that market in particular, we really need safeguards for communities, and especially a lot of technology a lot of investment in technology, so we can accelerate this. And the governments and private sectors need to have large-scale projects. We don't have a big enough scale for the projects that we need between now and the next few years. So we need to invest a lot in structuring projects so that we can move forward quickly in these markets. Thank you very much, Carlos Eduardo. Tatiana? Let's see if I can say all of this in 1 minute. It's important for there to be a balance between flexibility of regulations in order to be able to respond to any changes that are observed in the market, but at the same time, we need to have certain stability in the European market. Too many permits were issued because first there was energy efficiency before there was a change of fuel. So that was an effect. So we need to have that flexibility among the components so that we can respond to any changes. Thank you very much to this excellent panel. All these thoughts that you have shared with us will be taken into account by the IDB. I hope we can continue to work together with you and with all the CapiLAC members. As I said in the beginning, this is a very important market with a unique potential for this region. And as we've learned from this panel, it still needs a lot to be able to form an ecosystem, and we need all the actors and all their efforts. Once again, I want to thank all of you for your contributions, and we will see you soon. Thank you, Diego, once again for this opportunity. No, thank you, Maria. Honestly, I hadn't learned so much in such a short time for a very long time. So thank you very much, Mariana, Tatiana, Carlos Eduardo, and Pedro. This has really been an excellent panel. And Maria, your moderating talents helped everything flow perfectly. So thank you very much to you as well. This concludes our first day of CapiLAC. Tomorrow, if you could please show tomorrow's presentation on the screen. We have a super panel on financing of MSMEs in Latin America and the Caribbean. We have a document that we prepared with FIAB, directed by Professor Ed Altman. He is the person who invented the Altman C score. He's one of the most famous and admired people in the field of credit risk. Susana Cordeiro Guerra will be a moderator. She's our manager for the Institutions for Development for the IDB. And also we will have Gabriele Sabato, co-founder of Wiserfunding from Italy, which Professor Altman is also a part of. So that will be very interesting. And we'll also have a panel. In the next slide, you'll see it, where we will discuss prospects regarding regulations and the exchanges on how we can finance MSMEs using the capital markets. We'll have Christina Roll from the Securities Commission of Bahamas, Dr. Juan Pablo Cordova, President of the Colombian Stock Exchange of Colombia, and Miguel Angel Zapatero from the Lima Stock Exchange. And it will be an honor to have these guests with us tomorrow. So tomorrow, the day will be devoted to the topic of MSMEs. So everyone is invited to be with us at 10:30. We'll start a half hour later tomorrow. 10:30 will be our starting time tomorrow for our two panels. And lastly, I wanted to tell you that we will have a survey for you. Please, if you would fill it out today. And all the materials, bios, and presentations will be available to you. Even the videos will be accessible to you through the link that you see on the chat. Once again, thank you everyone for participating. Thank you to the team for that quick response with the presentations, etc. Thank you to our team in Argentina and our team in Washington, D.C. We'll see you tomorrow, and stay well.